The night Nate found Kaya bleeding in the snow, he thought he understood the cost of mercy. But when Naalnish stepped out of the darkness 3 nights later, knife in hand and eyes like flint, Nate realized the price was still being calculated. The old warrior appeared without warning. One moment Nate was standing watch outside the cabin, breath misting in the November cold. The next, a voice emerged from the shadows, speaking English with the weight of authority. "Give me the girl." Nate's hand moved to his Winchester, but he didn't raise it. The man before him stood with the stillness of deep water, gray hair falling past his shoulders, face carved by wind and time into something ageless. In his right hand, a hunting knife caught moonlight. In his eyes, the kind of calculation that came from surviving 52 years in a world that wanted you dead. "Who are you?" Nate asked, his voice low and steady. Before the man could answer, the cabin door opened. Kaya stood there, her left arm still bound but her right hand holding Nate's Colt revolver. When she saw the figure in the shadows, the gun dropped. "Naalnish." The old warrior's face transformed. The stone cracked, revealing something raw beneath. "Child, you're alive. Dakota would have been so proud." "Father," her voice broke on the word. "He's gone." "I know. I found what was left of the village. 23 dead. Your father died like a warrior, protecting the children." Naalnish's eyes shifted back to Nate, reassessing. "And this white man? He saved me, when he could have sold me for $500. Naalnish studied Nate with the intensity of a man who'd learned to read truth in the space between words. What he saw made him lower the knife, though not sheath it. "White men don't save Apache. They kill." "This one's different," Kaya said softly. "Maybe. Or maybe he's playing a longer game." Naalnish moved closer, close enough that Nate could see the scars that crisscrossed the warrior's hands, close enough to smell sage and wood smoke. "Tell me, mountain man, why help her?" Nate met his gaze without flinching. "Because it was right. Because I'm tired of seeing people die for no good reason. Because—" He paused, then finished with simple honesty. "Because I couldn't walk away." Something in those words landed. Naalnish's shoulders dropped a fraction, the knife finally sliding back into its sheath. "Come inside. If we're going to talk about impossible things, we should be warm while we do it." Inside the cabin, by firelight, the 3 of them formed an unlikely council of war. Naalnish sat cross-legged on the floor in the Apache way, while Kaya perched on a stool, her wounded shoulder clearly still causing pain. Nate stood by the window, keeping watch, listening. The old warrior's information painted a grim picture. The attack on Kaya's village had been led by Captain Hawkins with 40 cavalry. 23 Apache dead, most of them warriors who'd died defending the children, but 13 young ones had been captured alive, boys and girls between 8 and 16 years old, Cale among them. They were being held at Fort Bayard, scheduled for transfer to the San Carlos Reservation in 12 days. "But that's not the worst of it," Naalnish said, his voice heavy with disgust. "Hawkins doesn't just follow orders, he profits from them. He sells Apache, women to brothels on the border, children to anyone with money and no conscience, and he's especially interested in you, Kaya." "Why me specifically?" she asked, though something in her eyes said she already knew. "Because you're Dakota's daughter. Your father killed 15 soldiers last year in the battle at Sibique Creek, made Hawkins look like a fool in front of his superiors. The captain wants revenge, and he wants it public. He's put a special price on your head, $200 dead, $500 alive. You're bait for any Apache who might still be willing to fight." Nate's jaw tightened. "And he's hired help to find her." "Yes, the Dalton brothers. Ezra, Cole, and Jeremiah. 3 bounty hunters who've killed 20 Apache in the past 2 years alone. They know this territory better than most soldiers. If they're tracking her, they won't stop until they find her or die trying." Kaya's hand moved unconsciously to the bandage on her shoulder. "Then we have to move fast. before they find this place, before it's too late for Kale." "Move where?" Nalnish challenged. "Fort Bayard has 50 soldiers, high walls, guards who change shifts every 4 hours. Even if we could get inside, how do we get 13 children out without being caught? And then what? Where do we take them?" The silence that followed felt like a physical weight. It was the silence of people facing impossible odds, knowing the cost of failure was measured in young lives. Then Nate spoke, his voice cutting through the despair like an axe through frozen wood. "Mexico. There are Apache communities living free in the Sierra Madre Mountains. If we can get the children across the border, they'd be safe." Nalnish looked up sharply. "You know about the Sierra Madre communities?" "I know about a lot of things people think I don't, including the fact that Mongus leads a group of Mescalero Apache about 200 miles south of here. They've been there 5 years, and the Mexican government mostly leaves them alone." "How does a hermit mountain man know about Mongus?" There was respect in Nalnish's question now, not suspicion. "Because I listen, and because 8 years ago, before I built this cabin, I met an old Shoshone medicine man named Grey Wolf. He taught me about the land, about survival, about the Apache who refused to surrender. He told me stories about warriors who chose freedom over reservation life. Mongus was one of those stories." Kaya leaned forward despite her pain. "So we have a destination, but we still need to get the children out of Fort Bayard first." "Which brings us back to the impossible part," Nalnish said. Nate turned from the window, his gray-green eyes catching firelight. "Not impossible, just difficult. And it starts with understanding that we can't do this with force. 50 soldiers with repeating rifles against 3 people? That's suicide. We need deception. We need someone they won't suspect." "You," Kaya said, understanding dawning in her eyes. "You're just a mountain man. They have no reason to think you're connected to Apache resistance." "Exactly. I can get into Fort Bayard as a trader, bring supplies, maybe even get hired for a job that gives me access to the grounds. Once I'm inside, I can find the weaknesses, the guard rotations, the best time to strike." Nalnish stroked his chin, his scarred fingers thoughtful. "Dangerous. If Hawkins suspects anything, you'll be shot as a traitor." "Life's dangerous. Doing nothing is just slower dying." "And what about us?" Kaya gestured between herself and Nalnish. "We can't just sit here waiting." "No," Nate agreed. "You scout the approaches to the fort. Find the best routes in and out. Places where riders could hide. Trails that avoid main roads. We'll need that information for the escape." He paused, considering. "We also need supplies. Food, medicine, weapons. And we need information about what happens at the fort. Guard schedules, when supplies are delivered, who might be sympathetic." "I know someone," Nalnish said slowly. "In Santa Rita, a town 10 miles west of Fort Bayard. Miguel Santos. He's a smuggler, sells to both sides. For the right price, he'll sell information too." "Then that's where we start." Nate pulled out a hand-drawn map, spreading it on the table. 4 days to reach Santa Rita. We travel separately, meet there. Less suspicious than 3 people moving together. I'll take the main trails, play the part of a trader heading to sell furs. You two take the back routes, stay invisible." Kaya studied the map, her finger tracing paths only someone who'd grown up in this land would recognize. "Here. This canyon. It's narrow, difficult for horses, but it cuts 2 days off the journey if you know the way. Nalnish and I can make it through." "And there's a mission church in Santa Rita," Nalnish added, "run by a priest named Josiah Blackwood. I've heard he's no friend to Hawkins. His daughter was dishonored by soldiers under the captain's command. He might help us." "Might," Nate emphasized. "People talk about helping until it costs them something real." "True, but sometimes all you have is might and maybe." Nalnish stood, joints creaking slightly. "So we have a plan. Get to Santa Rita. Buy information from Miguel. Try to recruit Blackwood. Scout Fort Bayard. Then break in, steal 13 children from under the noses of 50 soldiers, and escaped to Mexico while being chased by the entire U.S. cavalry. He smiled grimly. Your brother Thomas. He must have been very important for you to do this. The mention of Thomas hit Nate like a fist to the chest. For a moment, the cabin fell away and he was back at Shiloh. April 1862, the smell of gunpowder and blood. Thomas lying in the mud, his uniform soaked red, looking up at Nate with eyes that still held hope even as life drained away. 3 hours of agony while his little brother died by inches, and Nate could do nothing but hold him and lie that everything would be fine. He was everything, Nate said, his voice rough. He was 19, believed the war would be over in months, believed in duty and honor and all those words that get young men killed. When he died, I swore I'd never care about anything or anyone again. Easier that way, safer. Kaya's hand found his, her fingers warm and alive. My father used to say something. Pain doesn't disappear, but the love we give to those who remain, that's what keeps us going. Your father was a wise man. He was. And now Keel only has me. I won't let him die in a cage like an animal. We won't let that happen, Nate promised. It was the first promise he'd made to anyone in 8 years. They spent the rest of the night planning details, routes, timing, contingencies. Nalnish shared everything he knew about Apache tracking methods, the ways to move unseen even in open country. Kaya talked about the children, who they were, what condition they might be in after weeks of captivity. Nate contributed knowledge from his war years, the patterns soldiers followed, the gaps in military discipline. As false dawn began to gray the windows, exhaustion finally claimed them. Nalnish slept on the floor near the fire, wrapped in one of Nate's bear furs. Kaya took the bed again, her body still healing. Nate settled into his usual spot, a chair by the window, rifle across his lap. Old habits died hard. But before sleep took him, he watched Kaya's face in the firelight. Even in rest, tension lined her features. She'd lost her mother, her father, her home, her entire world. And yet she fought on. That kind of strength humbled him. When he finally dozed, he dreamed of Thomas for the first time in months. But this time, when his brother spoke from beyond death's veil, the words were different. You kept your promise, Nate. You're not alone anymore. The next 3 days passed in a blur of preparation. They gathered supplies, tested equipment, planned and replanned until every step of the mission was carved into memory. Kaya's shoulder healed faster than expected, the stitches holding clean, her Apache constitution proving stronger than the bullet that had tried to stop her. On the morning of November 10th, they prepared to leave. The cabin felt different now, less like a hermit's refuge and more like the place where 3 broken people had become something else. A team, a family of necessity. Nalnish clasped Nate's forearm in the warrior's grip. If you betray her, I will hunt you across this earth and the next. Fair enough, Nate replied. And if I die trying to help her, tell my brother I did one thing right. Your brother knows, the dead always know. Then it was just Kaya and Nate, facing each other in the morning light. So much had changed in a week. She'd gone from enemy to ally, from stranger to something he couldn't quite name, something that made the frozen place in his chest feel warm again. Be careful, she said. The main trails are watched. I will. You do the same. Those canyons are beautiful but unforgiving. I've been climbing canyons since before I could walk. A small smile touched her lips. But thank you for worrying. I don't... Nate started, then stopped. Who was he fooling? Yeah, I'm worrying. Strange feeling after 8 years. Kaya reached up, her hand touching his bearded cheek. The gesture was brief, almost tentative, but it sent electricity through him. You're a good man, Nathaniel Coulter. Don't let the past tell you different. Then she was moving away, joining Nalnish, the two of them disappearing into the forest like smoke. Nate stood outside his cabin, watching until even the suggestion of their passage faded. Then he loaded his horse, a sturdy brown gelding named Ranger, and began his own journey. The first day passed without incident. Nate followed the main trail toward Santa Rita, playing his part perfectly. Just another mountain man coming down to trade furs before winter locked the high country. He passed other travelers, nodded greetings, kept moving. Normal. Unremarkable. Exactly what he needed to be. But on the second day, he felt eyes on him. It started as an itch between his shoulder blades, that sixth sense developed in war and honed in wilderness. Someone was watching, someone skilled enough that he couldn't spot them directly. Nate continued riding, but his awareness sharpened. Every shadow became potential threat, every sound magnified. That evening, when he made camp beside a creek, he finally saw them. 3 riders on a distant ridge, silhouetted against the sunset. Too far to make out details, but close enough to be deliberate. They wanted him to know they were there. The Dalton brothers. It had to be. Nate built his fire, cooked his meal, performed all the rituals of camp with exaggerated normalcy. But his mind raced. If they were tracking him, they'd followed him from the cabin, which meant they suspected his connection to Kaya, which meant the trap was closing faster than planned. He had 2 choices: lead them away from Santa Rita, away from where Kaya and Nyalnish would be waiting, or spring their trap on his own terms. Nate chose the latter. At midnight he doused his fire and slipped away from camp, leaving his bedroll stuffed to look like a sleeping man. He circled wide, using every trick of stealth Thomas had taught him during their hunting trips back when they were boys in Pennsylvania, back when the world was simpler and brothers could never die. It took an hour to work his way around to where the Daltons had made their own camp. 2 of them sat by a small fire talking in low voices. The third was missing, probably watching Nate's camp. Smart, professionals. From his hiding spot in the rocks above, Nate could finally see them clearly. 2 men in their 30s and 40s wearing trail-worn leather and gun belts, brothers by the look of them, same hard eyes and cruel mouths. The older one, Ezra by the description Nalnish had given, was massive, 6'4" and built like a bear. The younger, Cole, was leaner, with the careful movements of a marksman. "How long we gonna follow this mountain man?" Cole was asking. "He's been riding straight, no detours. Doesn't act like he's connected to the squaw. Hawkins says watch him. We watch him." Ezra's voice was gravel and smoke. "Besides, where's he heading? Santa Rita's got nothing worth traveling for except information. And who'd a hermit need information about?" "Apache," Cole concluded. "You think the girl already made contact with him?" "I think we keep watching. And if he meets up with her, we take them both. $500 for her, and Hawkins will probably throw in a bonus for the mountain man." Nate had heard enough. He slipped back into darkness, returned to his camp, and lay awake until dawn. When the sun rose, he broke camp and continued toward Santa Rita, but now he modified the plan. He'd arrived from the east, making it obvious he was coming from Fort Bayard direction, not from his mountain cabin. Lead the Daltons to think they'd wasted 2 days following the wrong man. Misdirection within misdirection. War had taught him that the best deception was layered. 2 more days of careful riding brought him to Santa Rita on the afternoon of November 14th. The town was small, maybe 200 souls, built around a central plaza with a church at one end and a cantina at the other. Adobe buildings baked under the late autumn sun. Somewhere in this town was Miguel Santos, who sold information to anyone with coin. Somewhere was Reverend Blackwood, whose hatred of Hawkins might make him an ally. And somewhere, Kaya and Nalnish were waiting. Nate stabled Ranger at the livery, paid the hostler, and walked toward the cantina. Behind him, distant but definitely there, the Dalton brothers rode into town. The game was accelerating. Soon, very soon, someone would make a move. And when they did, everything would change. Inside the cantina, the air was thick with smoke and the smell of tequila. A dozen men sat at rough tables, speaking Spanish and English in equal measure. At the bar, a thin man with gray mustaches watched Nate enter, his eyes sharp and appraising. Miguel Santos. Had to be. Nate ordered whiskey, drank it slow, and waited. Patience was its own weapon. After 10 minutes, the thin man moved to sit beside him. "You have the look of a man seeking something," Miguel said in accented English. "And in Santa Rita, I'm the man who helps people find things. For a price." "I've been told that." Nate kept his voice low. "Nalnish sent me." Miguel's eyes widened fractionally. That name carried weight. "Then you seek dangerous things. Come, we talk in the back where ears are fewer." As Nate followed Miguel toward the back room, he caught a glimpse through the cantina window. Ezra Dalton was dismounting outside. Cole was scanning rooftops with the practiced eye of a sniper looking for a perch. And somewhere in this little town, the third brother, Jeremiah, was doing what he did best: planning, calculating, preparing for violence. The mission to save 13 Apache children had just become a race against time, against odds, against men who killed for money and slept soundly afterward. But Nate had made a promise. To Kaya, to Nyalnish, to the memory of Thomas and all the innocents who died because good men did nothing. He wouldn't be one of those men anymore. Not today. Not ever again. Miguel Santos led Nate through a doorway behind the bar into a storage room that smelled of dried peppers and tequila. The walls were lined with crates and barrels, but Miguel moved to a corner where a small table and 2 chairs sat beneath a single oil lamp. This was where business happened, the kind of business that required discretion. "Nalnish is a name I haven't heard spoken aloud in months," Miguel said, pouring 2 glasses of tequila. "The fact that he trusts you tells me either you're genuine or you're the best liar I've ever met. For both our sakes, I hope it's the former." Nate accepted the glass but didn't drink yet. "I need information about Fort Bayard, guard rotations, supply schedules, weak points." "Information like that costs money, and asking for it costs life if the wrong people find out." Miguel's eyes, dark and calculating, studied Nate's face. "But Nyalnish also told me what you're planning. Rescuing 13 Apache children from a military fort. That's not greed. That's insanity or honor. Sometimes they look the same. Can you help or not?" Miguel finally smiled, thin and humorless. "I can help. For $30 and the satisfaction of knowing Hawkins will suffer." He leaned back. "You need to understand something about Captain Hawkins. He's not just following orders. He's building an empire. He captures Apache, sells them to anyone willing to pay. Women go to brothels. Strong men go to mines as slave labor. Children go to families who want servants they don't have to pay. He's made thousands of dollars in the past year alone." The whiskey suddenly tasted like ash in Nate's mouth. "And the Army doesn't stop him?" "The Army doesn't know. Or doesn't want to know. He files reports saying the Apache died resisting capture or succumbed to disease. Who's going to question a decorated officer?" Miguel pulled out a folded paper, a detailed map. "Fort Bayard, built in 1866. Square layout with 4 watchtowers. 50 soldiers currently garrisoned. The Apache children are held in a building on the west side near the stables. Easy to access if you're already inside. Impossible if you're trying to break in from outside." "When do they change the guard?" "Every 4 hours. But here's what matters. Between 2 and 3 in the morning, there's a gap. The night shift is tired. The morning shift hasn't fully woken up. 10 minutes when discipline is at its lowest." Nate studied the map, committing details to memory. Guard positions, gates, the building where children were held. "How many guards on that building specifically?" 2. Usually older soldiers, not expecting trouble. The real security is the fort walls themselves." Miguel poured more tequila. "But you have a bigger problem right now, amigo. The Dalton brothers are in town. I saw them ride in 30 minutes before you. And Cole Dalton is currently setting up on the roof across the street with a rifle that can punch holes through adobe walls." The information landed like a stone in Nate's gut. "They followed me. Looks that way, which means your window is closing. If they suspect you're connected to the Apache girl they're hunting, they'll move against you soon." Miguel stood, moved to the door, cracked it open slightly. Actually, make that very soon. Ezra just walked into my cantina, and he's looking for you." Nate's hand moved to his Colt, but Miguel shook his head. "Shooting him here brings the law, and the law here is paid by Hawkins. You'll hang before sunset." The smuggler thought for a moment, then grabbed a bottle from a shelf. "Go out the back, through the kitchen. There's an alley that leads to the church. Find Reverend Blackwood. He'll hide you until dark. Then we figure out our next move." "We? You think I'm letting Hawkins keep profiting while I scrape by on scraps? I want to see that bastard burn. Besides," Miguel smiled, "helping you might be the most interesting thing I've done in years." Nate moved toward the back exit, but paused. "Kaya and Naalnish. They're supposed to meet me here. I'll find them. Send them to the church. Now go before Ezra decides to check back here." The kitchen was cramped and hot, 3 women working over clay ovens. They barely glanced at Nate as he passed through and out into the alley. The afternoon sun was blinding after the dim interior. He moved quickly but not running, just a man going about his business. The church was visible at the end of the plaza, its white-painted adobe walls almost glowing. Behind him he heard Ezra Dalton's voice boom through the cantina. "Where'd that mountain man go? The big one with the beard?" Nate didn't hear Miguel's response. He was already moving, cutting between buildings, using every shadow. From a rooftop he caught a glint of sunlight on metal. Cole's rifle, tracking movement in the street below. The man was professional, patient, dangerous. The church's heavy wooden door swung open at Nate's touch. Inside, the air was cool and smelled of incense and old wood. Rows of rough-hewn pews faced a simple altar. Candles flickered in red glass holders. And at the altar, an old man in priest's vestments was arranging flowers with careful, deliberate movements. Reverend Josiah Blackwood turned at the sound of footsteps. He was 60 if he was a day, white-haired and thin, but his eyes were sharp and clear. Eyes that had seen too much and forgiven too little. "Sanctuary," Nate said simply. "Miguel Santos sent me." Blackwood's hands stilled on the flowers. "Sanctuary is for those fleeing injustice. Are you?" "I'm trying to stop it. Does that count?" "That depends on the injustice." The Reverend set down the flowers and approached, studying Nate with an intensity that felt like judgment. "Miguel doesn't send people to me unless they're running from Hawkins or working against him. Which are you?" "Both, I suppose." Something changed in Blackwood's expression. Not quite approval, but interest. "Come, we'll talk where thick walls provide more than spiritual protection." He led Nate through a side door into a small room that served as both office and living quarters. Books lined every wall. A simple bed in one corner. A desk covered with papers and a well-worn Bible. Blackwood gestured to a chair while he settled behind the desk. 13 years I've been in Santa Rita," the Reverend began. 13 years watching Hawkins turn this region into his personal kingdom. The Army promotes him, the government pays him, and people disappear. Good people. Apache people who just wanted to live on the land their ancestors lived on for 1,000 years. His voice hardened. "My daughter, Sarah, she worked at the fort as a laundress. Hawkins took a liking to her. When she refused his advances, he had her arrested for theft. She died in that prison cell, officially of fever. I know it was something worse." "I'm sorry," Nate said, and meant it. "Sorry doesn't bring her back. Action might give her death meaning." Blackwood leaned forward. "Miguel's message said you're planning something ambitious, something involving the Apache children currently held at Fort Bayard. We're getting them out, all 13 of them. Impossible. Probably. We're doing it anyway." Blackwood studied him for a long moment, then opened a desk drawer and pulled out papers. "These are baptism certificates. Blank. If questioned, you can claim the children are being transferred to a mission school in El Paso. It's thin, but it might buy you minutes if you need them." He paused. "I also have a wagon, old but sturdy, and clothes that would make you look like a freight hauler rather than a mountain hermit." "Why help us?" "Because my God teaches that defending the helpless is the highest calling. Because my daughter's ghost won't let me rest while Hawkins walks free. Because sometimes faith isn't about waiting for miracles. It's about becoming the miracle for others. The words hit Nate deeper than he expected. He'd given up on miracles at Shiloh, but maybe that was because he'd been waiting for them instead of making them. Before he could respond, a soft knock came at the door. Blackwood opened it to reveal Kaya and Nalnish, dusty from travel, their faces tight with urgency. Kaya's eyes found Nate, and relief flooded her features. "The Daltons are in town. We saw them from the canyon approach." "I know. They followed me from the mountains." Nate quickly explained the situation. "We don't have the luxury of time anymore. If we're going to do this, it has to be tonight." "Tonight?" Nalnish's scarred hands clenched. "We haven't scouted the fort. Don't know the exact layout of where the children are held. Miguel gave me a map, and we have something they won't expect. Speed. They think they have time to hunt us. We'll be gone before they realize we've moved." Kaya moved to the window, looking out at the dusty street. "Hawkins will send the entire garrison after us. Which is why we split up after the rescue. You and Nalnish take the children south toward Mexico. I'll lead the soldiers east, make them think we're heading for the Apache strongholds in the mountains. Buy you time." "No." Kaya turned, her dark eyes fierce. "We don't separate. We're stronger together." And 13 children move faster with 2 protectors than 3. Nate's voice was gentle but firm. "Nalnish knows the way to Mongus's people. He knows how to keep them safe. You know how to hunt, track, survive. You don't need me for that part. But you'll be alone against 40 soldiers." Her voice cracked slightly on the last word. "I've been alone for 8 years. I know how to make it work." Nalnish placed a hand on Kaya's shoulder. "He's right. The children must reach safety. That's the mission. Everything else is secondary." The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken things, promises that couldn't be made, futures that might not exist. Finally, Kaya nodded, accepting what she couldn't change. "Then we plan every detail. No mistakes, no second chances." They spent the next 3 hours mapping out the operation with military precision. Reverend Blackwood provided not just the wagon and clothes, but also information about the fort's recent activity. Miguel arrived as dusk fell, bringing food and additional intelligence. A supply wagon was scheduled to arrive at Fort Bayard at dawn. They could slip in just before it, in the chaos of the morning delivery. "But you'll need papers," Miguel said. "A manifest showing what you're delivering." "I can forge those," Blackwood said quietly. "I've had to forge many documents over the years. Birth certificates for Apache children so they couldn't be taken to reservations, death certificates for people who needed to disappear, letters of transit. The Lord forgives me these necessary deceptions." As night deepened, Nate changed into the clothes Blackwood provided. Heavy work pants, a less conspicuous coat, a broad-brimmed hat that shadowed his face. He looked like any other freighter making a delivery. Kaya and Nalnish would hide in the wagon bed under canvas and cargo. Once inside the fort, they'd have minutes to locate the children, get them into the wagon, and escape before the alarm sounded. "What about the Daltons?" Kaya asked. "They're still out there." "Let me handle them," Miguel said. "I'll spread word that I saw you heading north toward the mountains. Send them on a false trail. It'll buy you a few hours at least." Nate checked his weapons one final time. Winchester fully loaded, Colt revolver, knife at his belt. Then he looked at the people gathered in this small room. An Apache warrior, an Apache woman who'd become something more, a Mexican smuggler, an aging reverend. None of them had any reason to trust each other except for one thing. They all believed some fights were worth the cost. "If this goes wrong," Nate said slowly, "if I don't make it, you get those children to safety. That's the mission. Nothing else matters." Nalnish clasped his forearm. "You've proven yourself a warrior in spirit if not in blood. Your brother would be proud." Kaya approached last, and for a moment they just looked at each other. So much had changed in 2 weeks. She'd gone from a dying woman in the snow to a fighter planning an impossible rescue. He'd gone from a hermit hiding from life to a man willing to die for something that mattered. "Come back," she said softly. "We'll need someone to teach the children how to set traps that don't hurt." "I'll do my best." "Your best is why I trust you." She kissed him then, quick and fierce, a promise sealed in warmth. Then she was pulling away, checking her weapons, becoming the warrior her father had trained her to be. At 2 in the morning, they loaded the wagon. Kaya and Nalnish climbed into the bed, covering themselves with canvas and crates of actual supplies that Miguel had provided: dried corn, bolts of cloth, basic goods that would pass inspection. Nate climbed onto the driver's seat, took up the reins, and guided the horses out of Santa Rita into the darkness. The road to Fort Bayard was 12 miles of rough terrain. Nate kept the pace steady, not hurried, just another freighter making an early morning delivery. Above, stars wheeled in their ancient patterns. A coyote called from somewhere in the scrubland. The night was cold and clear and perfect for what they were about to do, or perfect for dying. Sometimes those were the same thing. Fort Bayard appeared as the eastern sky began to gray with false dawn. Wooden walls 12 feet high, watchtowers at each corner, the American flag hanging limp in the still air. Nate could see the supply wagon Miguel had mentioned pulling up to the main gate. Perfect timing. He guided his wagon into line behind it, his heart steady despite the circumstances. Fear was useful. Panic was death. He'd learned that lesson at Shiloh, and never forgotten. The guard at the gate was young, maybe 20, still rubbing sleep from his eyes. "Bit early for deliveries." Nate handed down the forged manifest Blackwood had created. "Captain Hawkins wanted this today. Medical supplies and cloth for bandages, said it was urgent." The mention of Hawkins's name did the trick. The young guard barely glanced at the papers. "Yeah, go on through. Unload at the quartermaster's building. That's the one on the south side." The wagon rolled through the gate and Nate's awareness sharpened to crystal clarity. Every detail mattered now. Guard positions, timing, the location of the building where the children were held. He could see it, exactly where Miguel's map had indicated. A low adobe structure with barred windows. 2 guards outside, both middle-aged and looking bored. Nate drove past, heading for the quartermaster's as instructed. Behind him he heard the guards talking. Normal morning conversation, complaints about the cold, speculation about breakfast, the mundane sounds of men who had no idea their world was about to explode. He parked the wagon, began unloading crates with the help of a private who'd been assigned to assist. Slow, methodical work. All the while his eyes tracked the fort's rhythm. The guard change was happening. New soldiers replacing old, confusion in the handoff, discipline at its lowest ebb. In the wagon bed, hidden beneath canvas, Kaya and Nalnish waited for his signal. Nate carried the last crate into the quartermaster's building. The private followed with another. The moment they were both inside, out of sight, Nate moved. One quick strike to the base of the private's skull. The young man dropped without a sound. Nate caught him, lowered him gently, tied and gagged him with strips of cloth. "Sorry, son. You're on the wrong side of this." He slipped back outside. The sun was just breaking the horizon, painting the fort walls gold. At the wagon, he knocked twice on the sideboard. The signal. Kaya and Naalnish emerged like shadows, moving low and fast toward the children's building. The guards there had their backs turned, watching the sunrise. They never saw the 2 Apache warriors coming. Naalnish took one down with a precise blow to the temple. Kaya's arm, still healing but functional enough, wrapped around the other guard's throat in a chokehold that rendered him unconscious in seconds. They dragged the bodies inside the building. And there, in the dim morning light filtering through barred windows, were the children. 13 young faces, Apache faces, stared up at them with eyes that had seen too much horror. They were thin, dirty, some bearing bruises and cuts, but they were alive. And in that moment, the impossible became possible. Cale, 15 years old and gaunt but recognizable, stood slowly. "Kaya?" "Yes, brother. We're taking you home." But there was no time for reunions. Naalnish moved among the children, speaking quick instructions in Apache. Stay quiet. Move fast. Trust us." They responded with the discipline of young people who'd been raised in a culture of survival. No crying, no questions, just movement. They filed out of the building, staying low, heading for the wagon. Nate helped lift them into the bed, covering them with canvas. 13 small bodies, barely breathing, hope and terror mixed in equal measure. The smallest was a boy who couldn't have been more than 8 years old, named Taki. He looked up at Nate with huge eyes. "Will they shoot us when they find out?" "Not if I can help it, son. Not if I can help it." But as the last child climbed into the wagon, a shout rang out across the fort. Someone had discovered the unconscious guards. Bells began to ring, the alarm spreading like wildfire. "Go!" Nate shouted to Kaya. "Drive them out now." "What about you?" She was already climbing onto the driver's seat, taking up the reins. "I'll buy you time. Just go." Nalnish jumped onto the seat beside Kaya. Their eyes met one final time, Nate and Kaya, across a distance that felt like forever. Then she was snapping the reins and the horses were bolting toward the gate. The guards there, confused by the alarm, saw only a wagon racing toward them. By the time they thought to stop it, Kaya had pulled a revolver and fired twice over their heads. They dove for cover and the wagon crashed through the gate, wood splintering, and then they were clear, racing into the desert with 13 Apache children and the fury of the United States Army about to descend. Nate turned to face that fury. Captain Hawkins emerged from his quarters, shirt unbuttoned, rage contorting his scarred face. "Stop them! Kill anyone who helped them!" Soldiers poured from barracks, grabbing weapons, mounting horses. The fort that had been sleepy and routine 60 seconds ago transformed into a hornet's nest of violence. Nate mounted his own horse, Ranger, and spurred toward the gate. Bullets whined past his head. One grazed his left arm, burning like fire, but he didn't slow. He crashed through the broken gate and aimed east, away from where Kaya had gone, drawing pursuit like blood draws sharks. Behind him, Hawkins's voice echoed across the desert. "After them! I want the girl alive and the rest dead. There's $1,000 to whoever brings them back." And so the chase began. 13 children racing for freedom. 2 warriors guiding them. 1 man alone, bleeding and hunted, leading an army away from the innocent. The desert stretched vast and unforgiving in all directions, and somewhere in that immensity they would either find salvation or death. Nate had made his choice. Now all that remained was seeing it through to whatever end awaited. The sun climbed higher, burning away morning cool, and the sound of pursuing hoofbeats filled the world like thunder. The November sun burned away the morning mist as Nate drove his horse hard across the New Mexico Badlands, leading 30 cavalry soldiers away from 13 children who deserved a chance at freedom. Blood soaked his left sleeve where the bullet had grazed him, but pain was just information now, something to be noted and ignored. Behind him, the sound of pursuit was relentless. Hoofbeats shouted orders. The occasional crack of rifle fire from soldiers who thought they might get lucky at long range. Nate knew this game. He'd played it during the war, both as hunter and hunted. The key was staying just far enough ahead to seem catchable while actually maintaining control of the chase. He angled northeast, toward broken country where ravines cut deep and rocks offered cover, terrain that favored a single man who knew how to use it over a large force trying to maintain formation. Every mile he drew them east was another mile Kaya and Nalnish gained heading south toward Mexico with the children. But 30 miles from Fort Bayard, in a narrow canyon where red rock walls rose like cathedral spires, Nate's luck changed. The first shot came from above and behind, the distinctive crack of a long rifle. The bullet struck a rock 3 feet from Ranger's head, sending chips of stone flying. Nate recognized that sound immediately. Sharp's .50 caliber, which meant Cole Dalton had caught up, and the bounty hunters were now part of this hunt. Nate yanked Ranger to a halt, swung down from the saddle, and dove behind a boulder as another shot punched through the space where his head had been a heartbeat before. Cole was good, very good. 800 yards away on a ridgeline and still nearly killing with every trigger pull. The cavalry was minutes behind, closing fast. Nate had seconds to decide. Stay here and fight, get pinned down and captured or killed, or abandon Ranger and go on foot into terrain where horses couldn't follow. It wasn't really a choice. He slapped Ranger's flank hard, sending the horse galloping deeper into the canyon. Then Nate scrambled up the rock face, using handholds and ledges he could barely see, climbing like his life depended on it because it did. Another shot from Cole's rifle sparked off stone near his hand. The man was tracking him even in motion. Impressive and terrifying. Nate reached a narrow ledge 20 feet up and pressed himself flat against the rock face. Below, the cavalry thundered into the canyon, following Ranger's hoof prints. Captain Hawkins at the lead, his scarred face twisted with rage. "Spread out! Find that bastard! He couldn't have gotten far on foot." But Nate was already moving laterally along the ledge, toward a crack in the rock wall that opened into a slot canyon. The kind of place Apache used for ambush. The kind of place where 30 soldiers became a liability instead of an advantage. He slipped through the crack into shadow and relative safety. From here, he could hear the soldiers below, their voices echoing off stone walls. Frustrated, confused. One man had vanished like smoke, and they were starting to realize they'd been led on a chase while the real prize escaped in the opposite direction. Hawkins' voice cut through the confusion like a knife. "She went south, toward Mexico. That's where they'll run. Lieutenant Morrison, take 15 men and ride for the border. I'll continue pursuit here in case this is another deception." Nate's blood went cold. They'd figured it out faster than expected. 15 cavalry riding hard could overtake a wagon full of children in a day, maybe less. Everything they'd sacrificed, everything they'd risked, was about to unravel. Unless he did something about it. Nate emerged from the slot canyon 300 yards from where he'd entered, behind the cavalry position. He'd lost his rifle in the scramble, but his Colt was still holstered, and he had his knife. Not much against 30 armed men, but sometimes all you needed was to be unexpected. He moved through the rocks until he found what he was looking for. The cavalry's horses, bunched together and guarded by a single private who looked barely 18. The boy was more interested in watching his comrades search the canyon than in watching the horses. Nate came up behind him silent as death, one hand over the boy's mouth, the other pressing his knife to the kid's throat. Not cutting, just promising. "I don't want to hurt you, son," Nate whispered, "but I need you to walk away from these horses and not make a sound. Can you do that?" The private nodded frantically. Nate released him, and the boy stumbled away into the rocks, too scared to even call for help. Good. He'd live to see 19. Nate moved among the horses, cutting saddle girths with quick strokes of his blade, one after another. 20 horses in 90 seconds. Then he pulled his Colt and fired 3 shots into the air. The horses panicked, scattering in all directions, saddles sliding off their backs. Chaos erupted. Soldiers came running, trying to catch their mounts. Hawkins was screaming orders. And in the confusion, Nate slipped away again, this time heading south, following Kaya. He traveled through the afternoon on foot, pushing his body to limits he hadn't tested since the war. His wounded arm throbbed, his lungs burned. But he'd bought Kaya more time, maybe enough. As the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, painting the Badlands in shades of copper and gold, Nate topped a rise and saw it. The wagon stopped in a dry riverbed. Kaya and Naalnish with the children taking a water break. They hadn't seen him yet. For a moment, he just watched. 13 young faces, still scared but beginning to hope. Kaya moving among them, checking on the smallest ones. Naalnish standing guard, his weathered face showing the strain of constant vigilance. They'd made it 40 miles in one day. Incredible progress. But they had 160 miles still to go, and now Nate could see dust rising in the south. Riders. Multiple riders. The 15 cavalry Morrison was leading had somehow gotten ahead of the wagon. Nate's mind raced through options. They couldn't outrun cavalry. not with a wagon full of children. But maybe they could hide. Or maybe, if the ground was right, they could make a stand. He scrambled down the slope toward them. Kaya saw him first, her face transforming with relief before hardening again with focus. "Cavalry coming," Nate said without preamble. 15 riders, maybe an hour behind you. We need to make a choice. Keep running or prepare to fight. Nalnish studied the terrain with eyes that had survived 52 years of warfare. There's a canyon 2 miles south, narrow entrance, wide interior, good water. Defensible if we have time to prepare. Then we use every minute we have. Nate turned to the children. They were watching him with those huge eyes, old beyond their years. "Listen to me. We're going to reach safety, but first we have to be brave for a little longer. Can you do that?" Cale, Kaya's 15-year-old brother, stepped forward. He was thin and scarred, but something in his bearing spoke of his father's blood. "We're Apache. We know how to be brave." "Good man." Nate gripped his shoulder. "Help me get everyone moving, fast as we can." They raced the dying light and won. The canyon Nalnish had mentioned opened like a mouth in the earth, wide enough for the wagon to pass through but narrow enough that horses would have to enter 2 abreast at most. Inside, the canyon opened into a bowl maybe 200 yards across, with a spring feeding a small pool of water, high walls on 3 sides, only one way in or out, a perfect defensive position if you had enough fighters, a perfect trap if you didn't. Nate unhitched the horses and led them deep into the canyon where they'd be protected. Then he and Nalnish began preparing. They rolled rocks to create barriers at the canyon entrance, gathered dried brush that could be set alight if needed, checked weapons and counted ammunition. They had 2 rifles, 3 pistols, Kaya's bow, and Nalnish's knife, against 15 trained cavalry soldiers. As they worked, Kaya gathered the children at the far end of the canyon, speaking to them in Apache, calming them, preparing them for what might come. Nate watched her, saw the strength her father had given her, and felt something shift in his chest. This woman had walked through fire and come out forged into something unbreakable. The sun touched the horizon when they heard hoofbeats. Lieutenant Samuel Morrison appeared at the canyon entrance with 14 soldiers behind him. He was young for his rank, maybe 28, with the kind of face that suggested he'd joined the army believing in honor and duty and was only now learning how complicated those concepts could be. Morrison raised his hand, stopping his men 50 yards from the canyon entrance. Then he rode forward alone, hands visible and empty of weapons. "I'm looking for 13 Apache children," he called out, "stolen from Fort Bayard this morning, and I'm looking for the people who took them." Nate stepped into view, Winchester leveled but not aimed. "The children aren't stolen, they're being rescued." "That's not how the Army sees it." Morrison's eyes took in the defensive preparation, the barriers, the determination. "Captain Hawkins wants them back. He's offering amnesty if you surrender now. Otherwise, he's authorized me to use whatever force necessary." "Hawkins is a liar and a slaver," Kaya's voice rang out as she appeared beside Nate. "He sells Apache children like cattle. We have proof." Morrison's jaw tightened. Something in his expression suggested he'd heard rumors, maybe even suspected. "I can't act on allegations without evidence." "The evidence is 13 traumatized children who were beaten and starved in his custody," Nate said. "But here's what I'm offering you, Lieutenant, a choice. You can attack this canyon and some of your men will die, maybe all of them. We're prepared to fight to the last. Or you can ride back to Hawkins and tell him you lost our trail in the dark. Give us a head start. Let us reach Mexico." "You're asking me to disobey direct orders. I'm asking you to choose between orders and conscience." Morrison sat his horse in silence, the last rays of sun painting his face half in light and half in shadow. Behind him his men waited, some looking eager for action, others looking uncomfortable with the whole situation. These were young men, most of them, who'd joined the army to fight enemies, not chase children. "3 days ago," Morrison said slowly, "I received a letter from my mother. My younger brother, he was killed last month. Apache raid. He was 17. He paused, and Nate could see the grief there, raw and recent. I have every reason to hate your people. Every reason to follow Hawkins's orders without question. But, Kaya prompted. But I rode with Hawkins for 2 months before I was transferred to Fort Bayard. I saw things. The way he treated prisoners, the way Apache women and children would arrive at the fort and then disappear, the way he always had money when the rest of us were living on army pay. Morrison's hands tightened on his reins. I told myself it wasn't my business, that I was just following orders. The oldest excuse in the world, Nalnish said from the shadows. Yes, and the one my brother would be ashamed to hear me use. Morrison looked at each of them in turn. I can't help you openly, but I can be a poor tracker in the dark. I can take my men on a long circle before I report back, maybe 8 or 10 hours worth of searching before I admit I lost you. Why? Nate asked. Why risk it? Because when I joined this army, I swore to protect the innocent, not to hunt children. Morrison turned his horse. Go south, fast. Don't make me regret this. He rode back to his men. There was a brief conference, voices raised in disagreement. One soldier, a sergeant with a hard face, clearly wanted to attack. But Morrison was in command, and eventually they turned their horses and rode away into the gathering dusk. Nate lowered his rifle, feeling tension drain from his shoulders. Beside him, Kaya released a breath she'd been holding. Can we trust him? For tonight, yes. Tomorrow, who knows? Nate turned to look at the 13 children huddled at the back of the canyon. But we bought time. Now we use it. They rested for 4 hours. Fed the children what little food they had. Let them drink their fill from the spring. Kaya checked each child for injuries, using the medical knowledge her mother had taught her. Most were suffering from malnutrition and dehydration, but nothing immediately life-threatening. Except for Taki, the 8-year-old boy. He'd been beaten badly at some point, and one of his ribs was cracked. Every breath caused pain. He needs rest, Kaya told Nate quietly. Real rest. Not bouncing in a wagon. We don't have the luxury of rest, not yet. I know. Her voice was heavy with the weight of impossible choices. But if he dies because we pushed too hard... Nate knelt beside Taki. The boy looked up at him with eyes that should have been filled with the innocence of childhood, but instead held only exhaustion and pain. Can you be brave a little longer, Taki? Just until we reach Mexico? The boy nodded, though it clearly hurt to do so. My father was brave. He died fighting. I can be brave too. You already are. Nate brushed hair from the boy's forehead, a gesture that reminded him painfully of Thomas. Just hold on. We're almost there. But they weren't almost there. They were still 120 miles from the border, from safety, from any chance of these children seeing another sunrise in freedom. At midnight, they loaded the wagon again and continued south. Nalnish drove while Nate and Kaya walked alongside, keeping watch. The children slept in the wagon bed, exhausted beyond consciousness. Only Kale stayed awake, sitting up front with Nalnish, learning. The old warrior was teaching him things his father would have taught. How to read the stars for navigation, how to sense danger before it arrived, how to carry grief without letting it break you. Dawn found them at the edge of a vast expanse of open desert. 40 miles of exposure with nowhere to hide. They'd have to cross in daylight, visible to anyone who might be looking. If Hawkins catches us out there, Nalnish said, we'll have nowhere to run. Then we don't let him catch us. Nate scanned the horizon. Nothing but emptiness and heat shimmer. We push through, no stops except to water the horses. 12 hours of hard travel, and we'll reach the mountains on the far side. From there, it's another 2 days to the border. They made it halfway across before the dust plume appeared behind them. Riders. Many riders. Hawkins had regrouped, added reinforcements, and was coming with everything he had. Nate did the math in his head. 40 cavalry against a wagon that could maybe do 5 miles per hour on flat ground. They'd be caught in less than 2 hours. Unless. He turned to Kaya. You remember the plan? If we get separated? Take the children to Mongus. Don't look back. Her eyes were fierce. But we're not separating. Kaya. He took her hand, rough and calloused from fighting and survival. If they catch this wagon, all of this was for nothing. 13 children go back to Hawkins. Or worse. You know what he'll do to punish them for escaping. So we fight. No, you run, and I buy you time. Nate, please. It was the first time she'd begged for anything. Don't do this. Someone has to, and I'm the one they want least. You're Dakota's daughter. You're valuable to them. Me? I'm just a traitor. They'll hang me and forget me. He managed to smile. Besides, I promised Thomas I wouldn't always be alone. For 2 weeks I kept that promise. That's more than I thought I'd ever have. Before she could argue further, Nate swung onto one of the spare horses. He grabbed a rifle, ammunition, and his canteen. Then he looked at Nyalnish. Get them to Mexico. All of them. Whatever it costs. I will. And when Hawkins comes for you, make him pay for every step. That's the plan. Cale stood up in the wagon, his young face desperate. Don't leave us. You're part of this family now. Which is why I'm doing this. Family protects family. Nate looked at each of the 13 children, memorizing their faces. Be strong, be brave. And remember that someone thought you were worth fighting for. Then he turned to Kaya one last time. She was crying now, tears cutting tracks through the dust on her face. Come back to us, when it's safe. Find us in Mexico. Please. I'll try. He leaned down, kissed her forehead. But if I don't, you live. You raise those children. You teach them that some white men are decent, and you don't let hate consume you the way it almost consumed me. I love you, she said, and the words hung in the desert air like a prayer. I know. That's why I'm doing this. Nate spurred his horse toward the approaching cavalry, leaving the wagon to continue south. Behind him, he heard Kaya's voice, broken but determined, telling Nalnish to drive faster, telling the children to hold on, choosing to honor his sacrifice by living. The distance between Nate and the cavalry closed rapidly. He could see Hawkins at the front, could see the captain's scarred face split in a grin of triumph. They thought they had him, thought one man alone was easy prey. They were about to learn differently. Nate had spent 8 years in these mountains and deserts. He knew every canyon, every water hole, every place where a man could make his stand. And he'd spent 4 years in the bloodiest war America had ever seen. He knew how to kill. More importantly, he knew how to make killing expensive. He led them into broken country where cavalry was useless, led them through narrow passages where they had to dismount, led them into his world where their numbers meant nothing and his knowledge meant everything. And as the sun climbed toward noon, painting the desert in shades of fire, Nathaniel Coulter prepared to make his last stand, not for glory, not for revenge, but for 13 children who deserved a chance to live free, and for a woman who taught him that his heart wasn't dead after all, just sleeping, waiting for someone worth waking for. Nate led Captain Hawkins and 20 cavalry soldiers into a labyrinth of redstone canyons where the November sun turned rock walls into furnaces and shadows into traps. He'd spent 8 years learning this land, and now every lesson would matter, every trick, every advantage wrung from intimate knowledge of terrain that looked the same to outsiders but spoke volumes to those who knew how to listen. He'd already cost them 2 hours in a twisting gorge where horses had to be led single file, and men cursed the heat and the dust and the mountain man who danced just out of rifle range. But Hawkins was relentless, driving his troops forward with promises of promotion and threats of court-martial. The captain knew what was at stake. If those children reached Mexico, if word got out about his slave-trading operation, his career was finished. He couldn't let Nate escape, couldn't let the truth survive. The chase led to a place the Apache called Skeleton Canyon, though white men had no name for it yet. High walls, narrow passages, and at the far end, a natural amphitheater of stone where a man could see his enemies coming, but they'd have to funnel through a bottleneck to reach him. Nate had scouted this spot years ago, thinking it would make a good last stand if he ever needed one. He'd never imagined the circumstances would be saving children instead of just dying alone. He dismounted, slapped his horse's flank to send it running, and took position behind a tumble of boulders. From here, he had clear lines of fire on the approach. The Winchester was loaded. His Colt had 6 rounds. He had maybe 30 rifle cartridges in his pockets. Against 20 trained soldiers, it wasn't much. But it would have to be enough. The first soldiers appeared at the canyon mouth as the sun reached its zenith. They came cautiously now, having learned respect for Nate's marksmanship in the past hours. One man had a grazed shoulder. Another had lost his horse to a perfectly placed shot. They knew the mountain man could kill them if he wanted. So far, he'd chosen not to. That wouldn't last much longer. Hawkins's voice echoed off the stone walls. "Coulter, you're trapped! Surrender and I'll make it quick. Fight and I'll make sure you die slow." Nate didn't waste breath on a reply. He sighted down the Winchester, aimed at a soldier trying to flank left, and put a round through the man's hat. The soldier dove for cover. Message delivered. Come closer and the next one goes through flesh instead of felt. "You're defending savages," Hawkins shouted. "They're animals. They killed settlers, killed soldiers, killed innocent people." Now Nate did speak, his voice carrying the weight of someone who'd seen too much death on both sides. "So did we. So did you. The only difference is, we wrote the history books." A shot rang out in response. The bullet sparked off rock near Nate's head. Cole Dalton, somewhere on the canyon rim with his long rifle. The bounty hunter had caught up again. Of course he had. $500 was powerful motivation. Nate shifted position, moving to where an overhang protected him from above. His wounded arm throbbed with every movement, the bandage soaked through with blood. He was running on determination and memories now. Thomas smiling before Shiloh. Kaya's fierce eyes when she'd first pulled a knife on him. 13 children who deserved to grow old. The soldiers began their assault at 2 o'clock. They came in a rush, 10 men charging the bottleneck while the others provided covering fire. Professional tactics, good execution. It would have worked against most defenders. Nate dropped 3 in rapid succession. Center mass shots that put men down hard. The charge faltered. The survivors scrambled for cover, dragging their wounded. Nate had proven he wasn't bluffing anymore. The price of reaching him was measured in blood. "Again!" Hawkins screamed. "I want him dead! Now!" But the soldiers had lost their appetite for dying. They'd signed up to fight warriors, not to assault a prepared position held by a marksman who didn't miss. One sergeant, a hard-faced man with 20 years of service, actually stood up and faced Hawkins. "Captain, we need to fall back, regroup, smoke him out, or wait for night." Hawkins' response was to draw his sidearm and shoot the sergeant in the leg. The man went down screaming, "Anyone else want to question my orders? We finish this now." The naked display of brutality shocked even the hardened troopers. This was no longer about duty or following orders. This was about a man losing control, letting his obsession override any pretense of military discipline. From his position, Nate could see the calculation in the soldiers' eyes. Some still loyal to Hawkins, or too scared to disobey. Others clearly questioning whether this mission was worth dying for. The unit was fracturing. If he could just hold long enough, they might break completely. Then everything changed. The sound came first. Hoofbeats. Multiple riders approaching fast from the south. Nate's heart sank. Reinforcements from Fort Bayard. Hawkins must have sent for them. Now instead of 20 soldiers, he'd be facing 40 or 50. The math had just become impossible. But when the riders appeared at the canyon mouth, they weren't wearing cavalry blue. They were Apache. A dozen warriors on painted horses, led by a man Nate recognized from Nyalnish's descriptions, Mongus, the elder who led the Free Apache in Mexico. He'd come north with fighters, responding to some message Nyalnish must have sent before they'd even reached Santa Rita. Mongus's voice rang out in English, accented but clear. "Captain Hawkins, your war with the Apache ends today." Hawkins spun, his face a mask of rage and fear. "You're on American soil. This is an act of war." "No, this is justice." Mongus gestured to his warriors. "You have stolen children, sold women, murdered elders. We have come to balance the scales." The cavalry soldiers found themselves caught between two forces, behind them Nate with his rifle. In front, a dozen Apache warriors whose reputation for close combat was legendary. Some soldiers raised their hands immediately, wanting no part of this fight. Others looked to Hawkins for orders. The captain's scarred face twisted with calculation. He was outnumbered, outflanked, and his men were demoralized. But surrender meant court-martial, meant all his crimes coming to light. He'd rather die. "Kill them all!" he screamed, spurring his horse toward Mongus. What followed was brief and brutal. Hawkins managed to fire twice before an Apache arrow took him through the shoulder, unhorsing him. He hit the ground hard, rolled, came up with his sidearm. But Mongus was already there, war club in hand. The blow caught Hawkins across the temple, dropping him like a felled tree. The rest of the cavalry, seeing their commander down and surrounded by Apache warriors, chose survival over loyalty. Weapons clattered to the dirt. Hands rose in surrender. The battle that could have been a bloodbath ended without another shot fired. Nate emerged from his position, Winchester still ready, not quite believing what had happened. Mongus rode forward, studying the mountain man who'd become a legend among his people in the past 2 weeks. "You are Nathaniel Coulter, the one who saved Takota's daughter." "I am. And you're Mongus. Nalnish spoke of you." "Nalnish reached my village 4 days ago with 13 children and a story I could barely believe. A white man helping Apache, risking everything for children not his own." Mongus's weathered face showed respect. "I had to see this man for myself. Also, Nalnish said you might need help with soldiers." "Your timing is excellent." Nate lowered his rifle, suddenly aware of how exhausted he was. "The children, they're safe?" "They are. Kaya tends them in my village. She would not rest until I promised to find you." Mongus smiled slightly. "That woman has her father's fire." The sound of more hoofbeats interrupted them. For a moment Nate tensed, but then he recognized the rider. Lieutenant Morrison, alone, riding hard. The young officer pulled up short when he saw the scene. Apache warriors, surrendered soldiers, Hawkins unconscious and bleeding. Morrison dismounted slowly, hands visible. "I should arrest all of you." "You should," Mongus agreed, "but you won't." "Why not?" "Because you already know what Hawkins is. You've known for months. You just needed someone else to stop him so you didn't have to." Mongus's tone wasn't accusatory, just stating facts. "Now you can report that renegade Apache attacked your patrol. Your captain fell in battle. You barely escaped with your men. No mention of stolen children, no mention of a mountain man. Just another skirmish in a war everyone's tired of fighting." Morrison looked at the captured soldiers, at Hawkins, at Nate. Then he made the kind of decision that separates ordinary men from those who live with their conscience intact. "I'll need statements from my men about what happened here. Consistent statements. And Captain Hawkins will need medical attention before transport to Fort Bayard for court-martial. I suspect his injuries will require several days of recovery before he can be moved." "Several days," Mongus repeated. "Long enough for certain people to be very far away." "Exactly." Morrison extended his hand to Nate. "Thank you for showing me that sometimes the right thing means breaking the wrong rules." Nate shook his hand, feeling the weight of what this young officer was choosing. "Your brother would be proud." "I hope so." Morrison turned to his men. "Sergeant Davis, get the captain stabilized for transport. Everyone else prepare to move out at first light tomorrow. We have a long ride back to Fort Bayard." As Morrison organized his troops, Mongus gestured for Nate to follow. "Your horse ran off. You'll ride with us to Mexico. Kaya is waiting." The journey south took 3 days. Nate rode with the Apache warriors, learning their language, their customs, their stories. They treated him not as an outsider, but as someone who'd proven himself through action. Mongus told him about the village in the Sierra Madre Mountains, a place where Apache lived free, where children could grow up learning the old ways. A place always threatened, but never quite caught. On the afternoon of the third day, they crested a ridge, and Nate saw it. The village spread across a valley, wickiups dotting the landscape like mushrooms after rain. Smoke rising from cooking fires, children playing. Normal life in a place that shouldn't exist but somehow did. And there, standing at the edge of the village watching the trail, was Kaya. She saw him and broke into a run. Nate dismounted and caught her as she crashed into him, her arms wrapping around him tight enough to hurt his wounded shoulder. But he didn't care. She was alive. The children were alive. Everything they'd fought for had succeeded against impossible odds. "You came back," she whispered into his chest. "I promised to try. Don't ever leave like that again." "I'll do my best." He pulled back enough to see her face. "The children?" "All safe. Even Taki is healing. They're traumatized, but they're alive and they're free." She smiled through tears. "Kayleigh talks about you constantly, says you're the bravest man he's ever met." "I'm not brave. I'm just tired of being afraid." "That's what brave is." The village welcomed Nate with a feast that night. 13 children, now fed and rested and beginning to remember how to smile. Cale sat beside him, pestering him with questions about fighting and tracking and survival. Nalnish told exaggerated stories about their escape from Fort Bayard, making Nate sound like a warrior from legend. Even Mongus, usually reserved, raised a cup of tiswin and toasted the mountain man who'd become an honorary Apache. Later, when the fire had burned low and the children had been put to bed, Nate and Kaya walked to the edge of the village. Stars wheeled overhead in patterns that looked the same whether you were white or Apache. The November wind was cold, but not unkind. "What happens now?" Kaya asked. "You go back to your mountains?" "I don't know. Those mountains were where I went to hide. I'm not hiding anymore." He looked at her, at this woman who'd gone from dying stranger to something he couldn't imagine living without. "What do you want to happen?" "I want you to stay. Here. With us. With me." She took his hand. "I know it's asking a lot. You'd be leaving your world behind." "My world was a cabin and ghosts. This is better. You'd be Apache. In everything but blood." "I think I've been Apache for a while now. Just took me time to realize it." She kissed him then, not desperate like before, but with the certainty of something that would last. When they finally broke apart, Nate felt something he hadn't felt since before Shiloh. Peace. The kind that comes not from hiding, but from finding where you belong. Over the next months, Nate learned to live in a new way. He hunted with the Apache men, learning their methods which were different from but complementary to his own. He helped build wickiups, worked leather, tanned hides. Kaya taught him her language properly, not just survival phrases. Slowly, the barriers of culture dissolved into something richer. A blending. In March of 1877, as spring turned the mountains green, Kaya told him she was pregnant. The news filled Nate with joy and terror in equal measure. A child meant the future was real, meant the past couldn't be undone, but could be balanced by something good and new. "Are you scared?" she asked. "Terrified." "Good. So am I. We'll figure it out together." Their daughter was born in October, as the aspens turned gold and the first snow dusted the high peaks. They named her Naichi Sarah Coulter, Naichi for Kaya's mother, Sarah for Nate's mother, a bridge between worlds. When Nate held his daughter for the first time, her tiny hand gripping his scarred finger, he thought about Thomas, about the promise he'd made at Shiloh to never be alone. He'd broken that promise for 14 years, but he'd kept it in the end. And this little girl, this perfect blend of two peoples who'd been at war, was proof that something good could grow from the worst soil. Kel, now 16 and training as a warrior, became the fiercest protector of his niece. The other 12 children they'd rescued grew strong and healthy, learning to hunt and track and survive. Some eventually returned to reservation life when conditions improved. Others stayed in Mexico, building families of their own. But all of them remembered the mountain man who'd risked everything so they could be free. News occasionally filtered down from the north. Lieutenant Morrison had indeed reported Hawkins for corruption. The captain was court-martialed, sentenced to 15 years in military prison. He died there in 1881, unmourned except by those who'd profited from his crimes. The Dalton brothers disappeared after Hawkins' capture. Cole and Ezra were reportedly killed in a gunfight in Arizona Territory in 1879. Jeremiah vanished completely, presumably finding safer pursuits than hunting Apache warriors and mountain men who shot back. Fort Bayard remained, but under new command that was less brutal if not entirely just. In 1890, when tensions between settlers and Apache had cooled enough to allow some movement, Nate and Kaya made the journey north. They returned to the Sangre de Cristo Mountains, to Nate's old cabin. It was still standing, weathered but sound. They rebuilt it together, making it bigger, turning it into a home for their growing family. 2 more children had followed Naichi, a son and another daughter. The ranch they established became known for its odd population, Apache and white working side by side. Children who spoke 2 languages and knew 2 ways of living. Visitors sometimes looked askance at the arrangement, but Nate had long since stopped caring what others thought. He'd found his people. Everything else was noise. Cale grew into a respected warrior and teacher, eventually marrying and having 5 children of his own. He never forgot the father he'd lost or the mountain man who'd saved him. Every year, he brought his children to visit Uncle Nate, making sure they knew the story, making sure they understood that courage sometimes meant choosing the harder path because it was right. Naalnish lived to see his 71st year, dying peacefully in his sleep in the village in Mexico. At his funeral, Nate spoke words in Apache that Kaya had taught him. Words about honor and sacrifice and the bonds that transcend blood. Words that would have made Dakota proud. As Nate aged, his hair turning gray and his beard going white, he often sat on the porch of his ranch and watched the sun set over the mountains he'd once hidden in. Kaya would join him, her hand finding his, comfortable silence between them. They'd lived long enough to see their grandchildren, long enough to know that what they'd built would outlast them. On quiet evenings, Nate sometimes spoke to Thomas, telling his brother about the life he'd found, about the woman who'd saved him by letting him save her, about children who carried both their people's blood and neither people's hate. He liked to think Thomas heard, liked to think his brother was proud that Nate had finally learned to live instead of just surviving. In 1927, Nathaniel Coulter died at the age of 84, surrounded by family. Kaya held his hand as his breathing slowed, her own breath shallow with grief, but steady with love. Their daughter Naichi was there, now 50 years old, with silver threading through her black hair. Grandchildren gathered, great-grandchildren played outside, their laughter drifting through open windows. "Do you have regrets?" Kaya asked him in those final moments. Nate smiled, thinking about the question, thinking about a frozen morning in 1876 when he'd found a dying woman in the snow and made a choice that changed everything. "Only one. I wish I'd found you sooner. We found each other when we were supposed to. Maybe. Or maybe we were just lucky." "You don't believe in luck." "No, I believe in choices. And I choose you. Every day. Every moment. From that first morning until now." She kissed his forehead, her tears falling on his weathered face. "And I choose you." Those were the last words Nathaniel Coulter heard. Words of love from a woman who'd taught him that hearts don't die, they just wait for someone worth beating for. He died the way he'd lived those final 50 years, surrounded by family, at peace. no longer haunted by Shiloh or Thomas or all the death he'd seen. Instead, filled with memories of children saved, of a woman loved, of a life that mattered. They buried him on a hilltop overlooking the ranch, facing east toward the rising sun, as Apache custom dictated. Beside him, they left a space for Kaya when her time came. The marker was simple, his name, his dates, and below, carved in both English and Apache. He chose courage, he chose love, he chose us. The ranch continued for generations. The story was passed down, father to son, mother to daughter. How a broken man found redemption in helping those who needed him most. How a woman taught him that strength comes in many forms. How 13 children got to grow old because someone decided they mattered. In a country built on conflict between peoples, between cultures, between those who came first and those who came later, Nathaniel and Kaya's story stood as proof that another way was possible, that bridges could be built if people had the courage to meet in the middle, that love didn't erase differences, but could teach you to honor them. Their great-great-grandchildren still live on that ranch in the Sangre de Cristo Mountains, still tell the story, still remember that November morning when a mountain man found more than a dying woman in the snow. He found his reason for living, and in saving her, saved himself. Some stories end in tragedy. Some end in triumph. This one ended in both, because life is never simple and salvation is never free. But it also ended in hope, in children laughing, in families blending, in the possibility that we can be better than our worst moments and kinder than our deepest wounds. That morning in 1876, Nathaniel Coulter thought he'd buried his heart at Shiloh. He was wrong. Hearts don't die. They wait. They heal. They learn to beat again for new people, new reasons, new tomorrows. And sometimes, if you're very lucky and very brave, they lead you home. The years that followed the rescue of 13 Apache children became the foundation of a story that would be told for generations. But the path to that legacy was neither simple nor without sacrifice. In the immediate aftermath, as Nate settled into life with Kaya's people in the Sierra Madre Mountains of Mexico, he discovered that saving lives was only the beginning. Teaching saved lives how to thrive became the real work. The winter of 1877 tested everyone. Food was scarce in the mountains. The children, still recovering from their trauma at Fort Bayard, woke screaming from nightmares. Some refused to eat. Others couldn't stop crying. Taki, the 8-year-old boy whose cracked rib had pained every breath during their escape, developed a fever that nearly killed him. For 3 days, Kaya worked over him with every remedy her mother had taught her, every prayer her father had believed in. Nate sat beside the boy's mat through the long nights, telling him stories about Thomas, about growing up in Pennsylvania, about anything that might give a sick child a reason to hold on. On the 4th morning, the fever broke. Taki opened his eyes and whispered, "Tell me another story about your brother." Nate did, and in that telling, something shifted. He'd spent 14 years trying to forget Thomas, trying to bury the grief so deep it couldn't hurt anymore. But these children needed to remember their dead, needed to honor them by living well. So Nate began to remember out loud. Thomas's laugh, his terrible singing, the way he'd believed so fiercely in doing right even when it cost him everything. And in remembering, Nate found that grief shared was grief that could be carried. Kaylee, Kaya's brother, became Nate's shadow that winter. The 15-year-old was hungry for knowledge about the white man's world, about how to protect his people from future attacks. Nate taught him to read and write English, skills that would prove invaluable. But more importantly, he taught him what his father Dakota had tried to teach through example. That strength without wisdom was just violence. That fighting was sometimes necessary, but never glorious. That the hardest battles were often the ones you walked away from. "My father died fighting," Cale said one afternoon as they worked on repairing a wickiup. "Was he wrong to do that?" Nate thought carefully before answering. "Your father died protecting children. There's no wrong in that. But he'd want you to know that survival is its own kind of victory. Living well, raising good children, building something that lasts. That takes more courage than dying in battle. You think I'm a coward for wanting to live? I think you're smart. And I think your father would be proud of the man you're becoming. By spring, the village had settled into new rhythms. The children were healing, finding joy again in small things. Running, playing, learning. Nate watched them and saw something he'd forgotten existed. Innocence reclaimed. Not the false innocence of never knowing pain, but the hard-won innocence of choosing hope anyway. When Kaya told him about the baby in March, Nate's first emotion was terror. He was 34 years old. He'd spent half his life running from connection, from responsibility, from the possibility of loving something he could lose. A child was all of that and more. But when he looked into Kaya's eyes, shining with joy and fear equally mixed, he knew this was the next step in becoming fully alive again. "I don't know how to be a father," he admitted. "Then we learned together. I don't know how to be a mother." She took his hands, placed them on her still flat stomach. "But we know how to protect. We know how to fight for what matters. That's a start." The pregnancy progressed through summer and into fall. Nate spent those months building. A larger wickiup for their growing family. Furniture carved from pine. A cradle that took him 3 tries to get right, each failure teaching him patience he'd never had before. Nalnish watched these preparations with something that looked like satisfaction. "You've changed, Mountain Man. When I first saw you, you had the eyes of someone already dead. Just still walking. I was dead. Or close enough." Nate ran his hand over the cradle's smooth wood. "Kaya brought me back." "No, you brought yourself back. Self. She just gave you a reason." The old warrior's scarred face creased with what might have been a smile. "Dakota would have liked you. He always said the best warriors were the ones who knew what they were fighting for." On October 15, 1877, as golden aspens glowed against dark mountains and the first snow touched the highest peaks, Kaya went into labor. It lasted 16 hours. Nate paced outside the wickiup like a caged animal, listening to her pain and feeling utterly useless. Inside, Apache women who'd delivered hundreds of babies worked with calm efficiency. They'd offered to let him stay, but Kaya had taken one look at his terrified face and told him he'd be more help fetching water and staying out of the way. Finally, as sunset painted the sky in shades of fire and copper, he heard it. The thin wail of new life. One of the midwives emerged, smiling. "A daughter. Strong lungs. Come meet her." Nate entered the wickiup on shaking legs. Kaya lay propped on furs, exhausted but radiant. And in her arms, wrapped in soft deerskin, was the smallest human being he'd ever seen. Dark hair, copper skin, eyes that couldn't quite focus but seemed to look right through him anyway. "Naichi Sarah," Kaya said. "After our mothers." Nate reached out with one massive, scarred finger. The baby's tiny hand gripped it with surprising strength. Something in his chest that he'd thought was permanently closed cracked open, flooding him with feelings too big for words. Love, terror, wonder, the absolute certainty that he would die for this tiny person without hesitation. "Hello, little one," he whispered. "I'm your father. I don't know what I'm doing, but I promise I'll figure it out." That night, holding his daughter while Kaya slept, Nate made peace with Thomas in a way he'd never managed before. His brother hadn't died so that Nate could spend his life hiding. He'd died so that life could continue, so that new generations could have their chance. This baby girl, this perfect blend of two worlds, was proof that Thomas's death hadn't been meaningless, that from the worst soil, beautiful things could still grow. The years flowed like water after that. Naichi grew into a strong, curious child who spoke both Apache and English before she was 3. She learned to track from her mother and to build things from her father. She heard stories about both her grandmothers, both her grandfathers, about Shiloh and Fort Bayard and the long journey to freedom. She grew up knowing she came from two peoples and belonged fully to both. Two more children followed. A son they named Thomas Dakota in 1879. A daughter they named Elise, which meant she gives life, in 1882. The cabin that Nate eventually rebuilt in the Sangre de Cristo Mountains had to be expanded twice to hold their growing family. What had been a hermit's refuge became a home filled with laughter and argument and the beautiful chaos of children becoming themselves. Cayley visited often with his own family. The serious 15-year-old grew into a respected warrior and teacher. He married at 20, had 5 children of his own. He never forgot the debt he owed the mountain man who'd risked everything. Every year he brought his children to stay for a week, teaching them about their heritage and making sure they knew Uncle Nate's story. "Why did he do it?" Cale's eldest son asked one night around the fire. "He wasn't Apache. We weren't his people." Cale looked at Nate, who was bouncing one of his own grandchildren on his knee. "Tell him." Nate thought about how to explain. "Because I'd lost my people, my brother, my purpose, and you needed someone. Sometimes it's that simple. You see someone who needs help and you either help or you don't. I'd spent 14 years doing nothing, being nothing. I was tired of it. But you could have died." "Yes, but I was already dead in every way that mattered. Your Aunt Kaya taught me how to live again." These conversations happened often as the years passed. The ranch became a gathering place for Apache families making the journey north from Mexico, for whites who'd heard stories about the strange place where cultures blended instead of clashing. Some visitors came with suspicion, others with curiosity. All left changed in small ways. The 12 other children they'd rescued grew and thrived in their own patterns. Some stayed in Mexico, becoming pillars of Mongus's community. Others eventually made the difficult choice to return to reservation life when conditions improved in the 1890s. A few married into white families, creating their own bridges between worlds. But none of them forgot. Every one of them knew they'd been given a gift. Time, future, choice. They honored that gift by living well. Nailnish died in 1885, having seen his 71st winter. He went peacefully in his sleep, his last words a prayer for the children he'd helped save. They buried him in the traditional way, facing east toward the rising sun. Nate spoke at the funeral, his Apache now fluent enough to honor the old warrior properly. He talked about courage and sacrifice and the way some men become legends not through violence but through protecting the vulnerable. "He taught me that being a warrior isn't about how many enemies you defeat," Nate said, his voice carrying across the assembled mourners. "It's about how many people you save, how many lives you make better. Nailnish was the truest warrior I ever knew." Reverend Josiah Blackwood continued his quiet work in Santa Rita until his death in 1895 at the age of 73. His church remained a sanctuary for Apache families traveling north, and his legacy of helping the helpless lived on long after him. When news of his passing reached Mexico, Nate and Kaya traveled to Santa Rita for the funeral. Nate spoke at the service, thanking the man who'd shown that faith meant action, not just words. Miguel Santos prospered after Hawkins's fall, his cantina becoming a safe haven for travelers of all backgrounds. He never took credit for his role in the rescue, preferring to remain in the shadows where he worked best. But those who knew the truth made sure he was never short of customers or respect. He died in 1904, and among the mourners at his funeral were Kaya and Nate, come to honor the man who'd sold them information that saved 13 lives. Lieutenant Morrison, now Colonel Morrison, sent a letter in 1890. He'd spent 13 years fighting for reform in the Army's treatment of Apache prisoners. The letter was brief but meaningful. Hawkins had died in prison in 1881. The trafficking operation had been exposed and shut down. Morrison himself had been promoted multiple times, his integrity recognized despite the difficult choices he'd made. He ended the letter with a simple line: "Thank you for showing me that doing right matters more than doing easy." As Nate entered his 60s and then his 70s, his body began the slow betrayal that comes to everyone who lives long enough. The wound he'd taken escaping Fort Bayard left his left arm weaker. His hearing faded. His joints ached with cold weather. But his mind stayed sharp and his purpose never wavered. He'd found his mission. Raise good children. Teach them to build bridges instead of walls. Show them that hate was a choice, and so was love. His grandchildren numbered in the dozens by the time he was 80. Great-grandchildren were arriving with regularity. They called him grandfather in both English and Apache, depending on which language they were using that day. He told them stories, taught them to hunt and track and build. But most importantly, he taught them that their mixed heritage wasn't a curse or confusion, it was a strength. Some people will say you're not enough of one thing or the other, he told them during one of the last gatherings before his death. They're wrong. You're not half of two things. You're all of both. You carry the best of two peoples. Use it. Build something beautiful with it. On a warm June evening in 1927, 84 years old and surrounded by family, Nathaniel Coulter took his last breath. Kaya held his hand, her own breathing labored but steady. Their children gathered close. Grandchildren filled the doorway. Great-grandchildren played in the yard outside, their laughter the soundtrack to his departure. In his final moments, clarity came. He saw Thomas, young and whole and smiling. He saw Dakota, the father he'd never met but honored through loving his daughter. He saw all the faces of people who'd shaped him, saved him, given him reasons to keep fighting. "No regrets?" Kaya whispered. He wanted to say something profound, something that would sum up 50 years of love and struggle and growth. But what came out was simpler and truer. "Only that I didn't find you sooner. We found each other at exactly the right time." She was right. She usually was. If he'd met her before Shiloh, before Thomas died, before he'd learned what loss cost, he wouldn't have been ready, wouldn't have understood what she was offering. Sometimes you have to break completely before you can be rebuilt into something better. They buried him on a hilltop overlooking the ranch, the Sangre de Cristo Mountains rising behind like guardians. The funeral blended Apache and Christian traditions, prayers spoken in 3 languages. Cale, now 66 and gray-haired but still straight-backed, spoke about the man who'd saved him and then taught him how to live free. He used to say that family isn't about blood. It's about who you'd fight for, who you'd die for, who you choose every day. Cale's voice cracked but held. He chose us, a 15-year-old boy he'd never met, 12 other children, my sister, my people. He chose us when he could have chosen safety. We're here today because one man decided we mattered. The marker they placed was simple granite, his name, his dates, and carved in both English and Apache. He chose courage. He chose love. He chose us. Kaya lived another 11 years, dying peacefully in 1938 at the age of 88. They'd had 51 years together. Not enough. Never enough. But more than many people got. She spent her final years teaching the old ways to great-grandchildren who would carry both cultures into the future. When her time came, they buried her beside Nate, facing east, together even in death as they'd been in life. The ranch continued. The story was passed down. Generation after generation, the tale of the mountain man and the Apache woman became family legend. But it was more than legend. It was proof. Proof that bridges could be built between peoples if individuals had the courage to try. That love could cross any divide if you let it. That the best way to honor the dead was to live well. By the 21st century, the descendants of Nathaniel Coulter and Kaya numbered in the hundreds. They were doctors and teachers, ranchers and artists, soldiers and peace activists. They carried both heritages proudly. And every year, on the anniversary of the Fort Bayard rescue, they gathered at the ranch in the Sangre de Cristo Mountains. They told the story. They honored the 13 children who'd been saved. They remembered that one person's choice to act could echo through centuries. The cabin still stands, reinforced and expanded, but recognizably the same structure Nate first built as a refuge. Inside, photos line the walls. Nate and Kaya in their prime. The 13 rescued children grown into adults with families of their own. Generations of mixed heritage descendants, each one proof that the risk was worth taking, that some fights are worth the cost. Outside, the mountains stand eternal, the same peaks that sheltered a broken man in 1868, the same peaks that witnessed a rescue in 1876, the same peaks that watched a family grow and thrive despite impossible odds. They'll stand long after the last descendant is gone, mute witnesses to the truth that stories matter, that choices matter, that one moment of courage can change the course of countless lives. In the end, Nathaniel Coulter's legacy wasn't measured in money or land, or even in the number of his descendants, though those were considerable. His legacy was this: he proved that people can change, that hermits can become heroes, that the broken can heal, that love is always, always worth the risk. That morning in November 1876, when Nate found a dying Apache woman in the snow, he had a choice: walk away and preserve his isolation, or help and risk everything he'd built to protect himself. He chose help, and in that choice he found not just redemption, but resurrection, a reason to live instead of just surviving. Some stories end in tragedy, some in triumph. The best ones end in hope, in laughter echoing across generations, in children who know they come from warriors and healers, from fighters and builders, from people who chose courage when fear would have been easier. This is one of those stories. It began with death and grief and a man trying to disappear. It ended with life and love and family that will carry his name forward until the mountains themselves crumble. Not bad for a broken hermit who just wanted to be left alone. Remember this: family isn't blood. Family is who you choose to stand beside, who you choose to fight for, who you choose to build a future with. Nathaniel Coulter chose 13 Apache children he'd never met, and in choosing them, he saved not just their lives, but his own soul. That's the legacy. That's what matters. That's what endures when everything else turns to dust. One man's choice, one woman's courage, 13 children given a future, and countless descendants who know that bridges between peoples aren't built by governments or treaties. They're built by individuals who decide that love matters more than hate, that mercy matters more than revenge, that every child deserves a chance regardless of who their parents were or what color their skin is. The mountains remember. The descendants remember. And now so do you.